Hi, I'm Cher Kaufmann. I'm international artist and author of the Artful Mandala coloring book and the Ancient Alchemy coloring book. And today I'm going to give you some basics on backgrounds. Alright, welcome everyone. We are going to go through examples for backgrounds today. One of the things that I have noticed as people begin to explore coloring books in particular is that a lot of times they stay within the lines, and that can mean that their backgrounds don't really get addressed. They don't get looked at as part of the design. They look at the edges of the image as being the only part of the image. So I thought I would just show you some different ways that if you wanted to begin to look at the background, in art they call it sort of the negative space. It's the space around the thing that you have your eye on. The background area can be very powerful to bring your image forward, to make it more dramatic. So what I have here are 10 different ways that you can do backgrounds. Now I am going to tell you that I have 2 other videos out there that have more information on 2 of these topics, and so I'm not going to go in as much detail with those, but I will point them out because I do want you to know that that is an example of something that you can use in your background just as much as you can use them in your design. So I'm going to go through these and then I'll tell you which ones we'll be working on today. So for those that are brand new to backgrounds, using just your pencils, just using the mediums that you have, and creating kind of a glowing effect or an outline effect where you take some of your colors and you just have them fade into the background is something that you can do quite easily with your pencils. And if you use an effect where you take either a blending pencil or even a lighter colored pencil and smooth out the layers of colors that you put there, you can have this soft vignette from the edge of your design into the open area of your background. And that can be the way that maybe you introduce playing with the background if it's not something that you have, if you're not comfortable moving into it totally. This is a way that I would say just to begin to play with moving color into the background by outlining your design, playing with some color that way. Here what I have is chalk, and really I mean sidewalk chalk, and I use some Q-tips to move this around. This is a pencil with using a blender pen. Using a blender pen is going to be something like this, and this is using a pencil or pencils rather with gamsol, and gamsol is a solvent that helps to break down and move the wax so that you can get blended effects as one color begins to move into another color. And what I suggest for these 2 here, and also for the pencil only example, is to go check out the 12 blending tip videos that I have that work specifically with pencils only. You will get a lot more detail and a little bit more time on how to work with those. But I do want to bring them into this video to remind you that these things and anything else that's in the 12 tips for blending pencils can be utilized in your background. And in this area here, I am going to show you how you can work with firm pastels. Pastels have quite a bit of information that are out there. There are soft pastels, firm pastels, there are pastel pencils, there are oil pastels. It's really quite a diverse medium all by itself. And so we're going to narrow down just to one particular type of pastel, and I'll show you how that can work for your backgrounds. This here is using eyeshadow. And I just went to the dollar store and got some eyeshadow from the dollar store and played with some eyeshadow colors that I found there. So it's whatever I found at the dollar store just to kind of play with, just to see what they do in the background and if it's something that I wanted to use on a bigger scale. Here I use pastel pencils, and I use them in 2 different mediums, and I'll explain a little bit more about that when I get into the exact examples. But one of them is actually using a little bit of water, and the other one is just using a Q-tip. And then in this area here, I used eyeshadow with an actual applicator that came with the eyeshadow. And then down here, there is a whole video that I have out there that is specifically on gel pen usage with colored pencils. I highly recommend that you go revisit that if you haven't seen that video in a while, or if it's new to you, or if gel pens are of interest to you but you are not sure how to work with them. The applications that I use in that video can apply to backgrounds, and what I have done here is, for those that have seen the gel pen video, is that this is the wet application where I use a damp brush to move the gel pen on top of the pencil that is already laid down as a first layer. So what I'm going to show you is there are many different ways to move color, to use color. But the first thing I want to do is I want to show you an example of where I just use pencil only in my background. And I'm going to move this up just a little bit so that you can kind of see that obviously my whole design is in pencil here, but I just moved those colors into the background and created the background to be something just as important as the design itself. So my imagination begins to expand. I wonder what is beyond the color space, because I know now something exists. And that's what's so powerful about including your background in your design, is letting the imagination to continue past the black line of an existing design and moving it by suggestion, by bringing it to life with color. So this is just an example with pencil by itself. So now what I have here is I'm going to show you a little chart of different ways that you can apply 4 of the different examples that I used out of the 10 that were on that first page there. And I'm going to go through different ways that you can apply pastels and eyeshadow and chalk onto paper, because there are many different ways that you can apply anything onto paper. But what I'd like to do is show you ways that are cheap, inexpensive, whatever you have in your house, something you can find at the dollar store. I would rather have you playing with backgrounds than waiting for something that is a fancy tool. So I'm going to get you started on something that is accessible, things that are accessible to you. And then if you want to get into the more advanced stages of art supplies, at least you'll know what you're looking for when you begin to advance into that stage. So this is going to be very helpful for the beginner or for those that have an art background but want to expand a little bit on different ways to apply color. So first I want to show you a little bit about what we're going to be working with. This is what we call firm pastels. This particular group is from Prismacolor, and it's the new pastel. It's a firm pastel. Soft pastels and oil pastels are slightly different. I'm not going to go through the differences too much into that. I want to just keep this narrowed down specifically because we have so much to cover in a little bit amount of time. But I'm just going to choose a specific color and just show you. Now you'll notice that I have broken these. They call that breaking it in. When you get your set of pastels, if you break it, there's these little numbers on this side. I want to keep that free from usage so I can keep track of which color I'm using, and this is the side that I will be using, is this other broken piece of the pastel, and it will allow me to keep track of if I ever wanted to go back and reorder a color, or at least know what the color is. I'll be able to reference it by the number. So we're going to be using a firm pastel, and we're also going to be using a pastel pencil. Now pastel pencils look a lot like a pencil in that they're sort of long, skinny. They're hard like chalk would be. And they have a harder way that they make contact with the paper compared to an actual pastel piece. A soft pastel or firm pastels and an oil pastel are going to have a little softer touch. They leave a little bit different pigment application when they touch the page, different than a pastel pencil will. And then we've got eyeshadow, and so I'm just going to use whatever I found at the dollar store. And then I also have a piece of sidewalk chalk. Now these things can just be applied straight to the paper, but you will find that when you play with them, these are all very different tools, and how you make contact with the paper will make a big difference on the end result of what you're looking for. Most people that are working with backgrounds tend to want to look at something that's a little bit softer. So here's an example of where this is all chalk. And it's a very soft background, and it allows my image to be the focal point. So what we'll be looking at is ways to create soft backgrounds. If you want to go into richer colors, you'll end up with different dramatic effects. Here's an example, whoops. Here's an example of a much more vibrant color background, but it still has sort of a softness to it. Okay, so let's move into showing you how to work with these. I'm going to move a little bit of this off to the side so that I have some working space, and you will find that because I'm going to work with these all at once, my hands are going to get pretty messy, and it's mostly because of the way that these move, and I'm going to give you some helpful hints with that as we move through. So here is an example. We're going to start with the firm pastel, and you can use a Q-tip. You can just apply a little bit of the coloring to a Q-tip, and you can make small little circles, and you're basically with all of these kind of massaging the color into the tooth of the paper. If you're not familiar with what the tooth of the paper is, it's basically the surface texture of the paper. Normally when you're working with pastels or charcoal, you end up with a thicker or a wider tooth so that it can grab the pastel or grab the charcoal. But most coloring books, for people that are working with coloring books, it's a pretty smooth texture or a medium texture, and so massaging it in is going to be taking it into the grooves of the tooth of the paper. Tooth of the paper has mountains and valleys, for the easiest way to describe it, and mountains would be just the very surface of it, and the valley would be the deeper areas. So the advantages of using a Q-tip is that you can get right up to an edge. Now if you're working with a background, let me pull this back up here real quick for you. I have a direct edge with something, and so you'll notice that a Q-tip will be very helpful to get into these smaller spaces that kind of V into a divot. If I'm working with a larger area, and I'm going to show you here if I just draw a little bit here, and I use my Q-tip just so that you can see what happens. You'll notice that the tooth of the paper is showing a little bit of its surface because it has gripped onto the pastel. In other words, this is a softer area. It almost has a cloud-like effect, but you can see the darker areas of where the pastel made contact with the paper here. And what I'm doing is moving it from the top of the surface into the grooves of the tooth of the paper this way. If you don't mind the texture of that, you can draw directly onto your paper. If it's something that you want to soften, you're going to want to use the Q-tip. Okay, now what I do want to caution you is that Q-tips can leave lines. So if you are drawing something like this, be aware that you're going to be creating a line. So you want to do soft circles. Okay, pastel pencil. Pastel pencil, I'm going to show you this way here if I just apply it. And I'm just going to use the other side of this Q-tip. If I move it this way, the same thing happens as if it was the pastel stick, the firm pastel stick, is that there is a soft area and there is also an area where I can still see where it made contact with the top level, the surface level of the tooth of the paper. The other way that you can work with is by actually loading up the Q-tip. And the same thing is going to happen anytime I use the Q-tip, is that I can get right up against the edge, but it's going to be a little bit softer than if I drew directly onto the paper. Okay? Now eyeshadow. Eyeshadow can be done where you use a cotton swab. This particular one from the dollar store that I was getting here it breaks up pretty quickly. It breaks up very easily. So the example that I'm going to show you here is I'm really just kind of dabbing this. In other words, I'm not rubbing into this because this is really, it's just a powder. And I just want to load this enough that I can move it onto my paper. Same thing, small little circles, moving it in a way that is massaging this into the paper. I can get right up to the edge if I'm using a Q-tip. And then with chalk. Chalk here, I'll show you both ways here if I do chalk this way. It does the same thing as the pastels, where I can see where it made contact with the surface. The other way is to load up the Q-tip. I can go right up to an edge. I get a softer look. If I take my time, I can make it soft and billowy. If I lighten my touch, I can make it very, very light. Okay, all right, so now the next examples we're going to move pretty quickly, so now that you can see the pattern of how we're going to be moving. So the next is going to be a cotton ball, and I'll show you a way that I can do it this way, where I can move it with a cotton ball. I can also load my cotton ball up with my pastels. It'll be much softer if I'm loading it up onto the cotton ball itself than if I'm drawing straight on there. And here we'll show you. And if I load it up, very, very soft if I'd use the cotton. Eyeshadow, I'm just going to dab a little bit here. Load it up. Very soft. And with chalk. I'll show you both ways here. I'm going to load it up this way first. And then if I move the chalk, if it's applied directly. Very soft. Okay, now for those of you that are looking for ways to do something economical, I'm just going to use a regular kitchen sponge. I've cut it down. The neat thing about sponges is that you can use soap and water and wash them off and let them dry, and you can have a sponge that you can use over and over again. So I'll show you here. If I use this sponge. Now I do want to let you know, as we're beginning to move through these, there is dust that is going to happen with all of these. There's a little bit of dust that is being moved, not only because of the medium that's pushing it around, but also because of by the nature of what we're working with, it crumbles. On a very small scale, it crumbles. All of these are going to have a little bit of dusting. If you have respiratory issues, you want to take this into consideration. You may want to do something like the gel pen or the pencils only. If you don't want to deal with the dust, please do not blow the dust off your paper. You are actually creating a health hazard by putting that into the air in a finer dust where you can just breathe it back in. You're creating recirculation. If you are working with something, I'll use this as an example. This is one of my practice pages. If I'm doing something and I'm creating a lot of dust, please take this and take another piece of either another piece of paper or a plastic or this is a paper plate. You want to take it and you want to shake it out so that it lands on another surface that you can throw away. You don't want to blow it into the air. That's really bad news. It should be probably working with any of these. That's a 101 example on not how to do moving the dust. Okay, so here you can see what a regular sponge does. So you'll notice that the regular sponge, because there's open places in the sponge, there's open places where it applies. It's not going to massage it in the same way as a cotton ball. Okay, so here we'll do the pastel pencil. And if it's loaded up, that's soft there. And then eyeshadow. So the eyeshadow I'm just going to apply directly here. I'm going to tap it in so you can see. And with the chalk, I'm going to show you a couple different ways. I'm going to load it up this way. And if I load it up this way. Okay, now I do want to introduce you to something that you may not think about, but you can certainly find these at the dollar store or at any grocery store actually, is the Cosmetic sponge. Women use these to move makeup around in a very soft way without having to use their fingers. So here is a way that you can use this for an application of any of these here. And I'll do this here and just show you how it moves it. And then also if I load it up onto the Cosmetic sponge. The Cosmetic sponge I have found is actually the softest. It has very, 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 very tiny holes in a Cosmetic sponge, smaller than even the cotton is going to be moving it. So the way that it holds any of the pigments on here is very, very soft. So it's a very soft way of applying the actual pigments to the paper. And you'll notice it almost looks like this is two different colors. This almost looks like a more lavender, and this one looks more like a deeper purple, just because of the way it's being applied to the paper. Pastel pencil. I'm just going to use the other side of this. Really like the softness that this provides. If I'm looking for something that's super soft, the Cosmetic sponge gives a very light pastel look to things. Okay, I'm going to get a new one here for you for the eyeshadow. I'm just going to dab it in because this is quite a loose, compact powder here. And then the chalk. The chalk I think is kind of hard to move with very, very light. I don't even know if the video is going to be able to pick that up for you. It is so, so light. It's a really nice soft color if that's what I was looking for, but for you to be able to see it, it might be a little bit light for you, but it's a very light, it's very soft, very, very soft. Okay, now another thing that you might find at the dollar store or in the, the cosmetic area is what they call a cotton pad, and a lot of times people use this to take off makeup or to use it for facial cleaning, but it's something if you didn't have cotton balls or you didn't have a Q-tip, you could use these, but I do have to tell you they're a little bit more unpredictable. They're loose, they have a different kind of weave. I have found that I almost want to kind of wrap them around my finger to try to hold them into place, but they're a little bit more unpredictable as to where they're making contact. So I'm just going to show you with it kind of wrapped around my finger and if it's fully loaded. Okay, and then here. And fully loaded. One little tip that you might want to think about also if you decide to work with any of these, that you will need to fix your coloring afterwards. In other words, you'll need to use a fixative. This is an example of a fixative here. They also have a workable fixative. Workable fixatives allow you to continue to work on the paper because it creates like a plastic layer that creates a little bit of texture. You can continue to work. A final fix means that it has sealed it and you won't be able to work on top of that, but it seals all the powders, the loose powders that are created through pastels or eyeshadow or chalk, and it seals that down so that you can store them very easily. Okay, and then here with eyeshadow, I'm just gonna dab this in. Now this doesn't nearly hold the same amount of pigment, and I'm finding that I'm really going to have to go back and apply this. One thing I don't like about working with this is that it's a little bit more unpredictable for me to work right up against a line. If I needed an exact or small space, this is not as not as easy to count on where it will go. And if it's loaded, okay, very soft. All right, now applicator. The applicator is really just more for the eyeshadow. I'm just going to do this one on the eyeshadow because really there is no applicator for the pastels or the chalk, but I do want to show you what it looks like if I'm using the applicator that it came with. So I'll use this same color and kind of load up this little sponge that's at the end. And here I'm going to do actually very light, and I'm going to work my way into a firmer contact. If I go in too quickly, too hard, it's going to create a line I can't really get around unless I'm really, I'll show you what I mean. If I go in hard and I put that in there, I'm going to have to work with this. See, it's just now, it's created a space very similar to like when the pastel or the chalk leaves a line. So if you go in soft and do small little circles, you're going to end up with a more consistent area and you can get up to the edges. And what's neat about this is that if you wanted to go back in and blend, you can with a different color. Actually, you can do that with any of these. You can blend different colors. Okay, so that's just the applicator that comes with the eyeshadow. Now, for women that have eyeshadow brushes or extra brushes in their makeup kits, these are just 3 things that I have not used, and I just thought I would just play with them just to see if you wanted to play with a brush. Now, I have found that I end up with more dust because really when you're applying makeup with a brush, the natural oils of your skin grab onto the powder of the eyeshadow or blush or whatever it is that you're applying this way. But with the paper, it does not have the same kind of quality. The tooth of the paper is not going to be grabbing the dust, the powder, the same way. So while this is a very soft way to work with it, I'm finding that I have to kind of gather up any of the dust from the powder that moves off of the brush in an area that I'm not necessarily even at. I have to kind of go back and gather it. But if this is all you have, you can use that. You can use that. Okay, so here I'm going to show you what it's like to work with the pastel pencils because they're a little bit more like the way chalk works. And I've just applied a harder application of the color here, and I've moved into a lighter application of pastel pencils. And I'm just going to show you what I'm going to use. I have a very, very little tiny bowl of water, and I'm going to use a flat brush, just a synthetic flat brush. And I'm just going to get a little bit of water on the end of it. And I'm going to take a paper towel and I'm going to blot out the extra. Because if I go to my paper, especially if you're using this for coloring books, the paper is not designed to be what they call mixed media. Mixed media can usually handle a little bit of wet application in medium, but usually coloring books cannot handle a lot of wet. So you're going to want to definitely get out any extra so that your brush is damp, not wet. But what's nice is that it begins to move the powder of the pastel and it begins to massage it into the tooth of the paper. And so it's a way of creating a soft look and getting it into the tooth of the paper. I'm just going to massage this little area here that has a little bit of extra and begin to pull it. I'm going to add a little bit of water here and see if I can show you. Yeah, you may not be able to pick that up on the video, but it's a very light vignette as it begins to move out, almost like a blending effect. But I'm telling you, this is not a lot of water. It's just enough to gather what the dust has been created on the pastel and begin to massage that into the tooth of the paper and soften that as it moves out. Okay, so that's one way that you can use the brush with a pastel pencil. And if you're curious, let's see if we can try that with the chalk here real quick for you. And go into a lighter area. Gathering a little bit of the dust. I don't know if I like this the same way. Yeah, this chalky consistency actually does not move nearly as easily. You'll notice that even my brush strokes, it's like it holds the brush strokes in a totally different way. And the paper is, the water's going immediately into the paper. The chalk is not actually creating a barrier, whereas the pastel pencils create a little bit of a barrier in the paper withheld. So if you want to experiment, always start with a lighter and maybe on a scratch piece of paper or on a coloring page that you don't mind experimenting with before you go into one that feels more important to you. Okay, and then our last one that I want to show you here is really using your hands. This is the way that pastels are traditionally used. So my fingers are going to get pretty dirty here, but pastels are a very hands-on way of playing. So I'm actually just I'm gonna put some of these down here this way, and I'm gonna put a little bit of this here. I'm gonna move this over this way, just so that you can see what happens with using your fingers. Now, oftentimes they suggest to use like your pinky finger for pastels so that you're not putting a whole bunch of pressure down. You have a little bit more control over what's happening. But you'll notice it also massages into the paper. It does leave that area where it's a little bit darker. I am going to use a towel that is wet, and then I have a dry towel just to do a quick clean of hands. And that's the way, if you want to do something where you're not having to leave your desk every time and having to wash your hands, is just have a wet rag and a dry rag so that you can wash your hands. And then we'll show you the pastel pencil, and you can move and gather the dust. Just do small little circles, massage that in. You can do real nice blending. Okay, and then just to show you on the chalk, and if you're curious to see what would the eyeshadow look like if you were using your hands, then let's do that too. And so I will dip my little pinky in here. So if you didn't have a Q-tip and you only had your eyeshadow and your hands, now I will tell you, I do not recommend you using, if you wear eyeshadow, I don't recommend you using your personal makeup for your art supplies. You do not want to be sticking your hands in and out of something that you're going to be putting near your eyes. It's a way of introducing dirt and bacteria near your eyes. So if you're going to be using eyeshadow, have some specifically that's set aside just for playing with your art supplies. Don't use that for your actual personal makeup. So any of these here, what you'll want to do if you're using them on your paper is you're going to want to fix them with the fixative, which is mentioned just a little bit ago. You're going to just do a real light spray, and it adheres any of the extra dust to the page, and then you'll be able to store it. I do recommend, if you're going to do a fixative, and I have heard people talk about using hairspray as a fixative. Just make sure that it sprays either a real fine mist or has something like an aerosol where you are getting a consistent spray, because you don't want it to sputter onto your page and end up with like a little wet mark. Okay, my last little thing that I do want to show you here, and this is something that is just pure play, something that if you're ever interested in, is that you can take an eraser and you can create streaks of lines if you're deciding to play with any of your pastels. You are going to end up with the little eraser bits there, so the same thing that I would recommend for any of these here is don't blow. Actually take this over to someplace else, and you're going to want to tap it out and then toss this. You won't be putting it in the air if you work with it that way, but just to show you, we'll do this here. I'll just take it straight through, and I'll take it straight through. So you can use an eraser if you need to create a space where there is either a highlight, or if you wanted to, now you'll notice this is probably gathering a little bit of dirt too and spreading it around, so we'll just have to be a little careful here. I want to show you if I move a little bit of this out of the way. You can also use a bristle brush to move any of your little dust pieces off, and it won't create the smudge marks. If you needed to create a design where you're lifting off, or if you've created a little bit of a mistake, the darker your color, the harder it is going to be to actually have it move to white, but you can create a lightening effect. Usually once you've hit a dark space, it moves into the grooves of the tooth of the paper, and that's really hard to pull away completely. But it's something that at least you can play with if you wanted to do, you know, something for an actual design. So I could actually really create something for fun in my backgrounds by simply using my eraser. I'm going to use my hands here. So you can see that you can actually get playful with eliminating some of your color and make it kind of a wispy thing in the background that way. Okay, so I want to show you just one last example. Now this is a pretty light example. I'm not sure if it's going to show all the colors. This is a very soft coloring in the background. This is an example of combining chalk and pastel together in the background, and I used cotton balls and Q-tips with this one. And this one I want to show you that I just showed a few moments ago earlier, is that you'll notice in this area there's some streaky marks or some darker places. That's what happens when you use a Q-tip and you're moving it in a fast way rather than in the soft circles. I wanted to show this as an example of that you can actually, if you are doing that on purpose, create these lines. But if you move in soft circles, you can actually avoid having these lines show up in your backgrounds. And then just one last quick example. I just wanted to show this just briefly as an idea of that you don't have to do your full background. Sometimes it's just simply implying the background by doing a little bit of it, just enough to bring your design forward. So there's a bunch of different ways that you can apply backgrounds. If you are curious about the other videos that were mentioned at the very beginning, I highly suggest that you go check out the 12 blending tips for pencils. Those are all applications that can be used for backgrounds, as well as the video for gel pens, because those are very unique ways of adding a touch of glitter into your image by just bringing a little bit into the background and then softening the lines of the gel pens. You can check that out in the video as well. I have other tutorials. Please check those out on YouTube, Share the Fire 9. And also, if you're interested in looking at the coloring books that all these designs have come from, the Ancient Alchemy coloring book, Celtic Knots, Mandalas, and Sacred Symbols, as well as the Artful Mandala coloring book, Creative Designs for Fun and Meditation. And please check out the Mandalas and More, a meditative drawing and coloring book that teaches you how to do drawing as well as insightful inspiration on ways to live your life. Happy coloring! Thank you for joining me. I'm Cher Kaufmann. Until next time from the drawing desk, may you find more color in your day.